Part 2, World War I of the lecture Safe for Democracy. And today I want to start with this photograph. And this photograph is really in the middle of the pivotal moment that will lead to World War I. And so the guy you see here in the funny poofy hat, that is Franz Ferdinand. He is the Archduke of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. That is his wife, Sophie, that is next to him. And then you see other officials. This is coming out of the hospital. So a little bit of background. This is the crown prince for the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Franz Joseph, his uncle, is the current emperor. He is unhappy with his nephew because he married this woman, a commoner. He's not the brightest. He's a little dorky. He's kind of overweight and funny looking, and he's a bit of a nerd, but he is the crown prince. And on Sunday, June 28th, 1914, and around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Franz Ferdinand and Sophie are driving through the capital of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and it is there that there is the first step of an assassination attempt. A member of the Young Bosnians and an anarchist named Gavrilo Princip, a 19-year-old young man, is part of a small group that are Serbian nationalists. They want to break away from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and so their goal is to assassinate Franz Ferdinand. And as the motorcade is going down the street, they come running out of the crowd. They chuck a bomb into this open car that you see in front of you here. Franz Ferdinand bats it away from in front of his wife, and it goes off into the crowd. And it misses most people, but a number of people are injured. Nobody dies. A few people are injured, and they are taken to hospital. Franz Ferdinand is concerned about the locals who were injured, and so he instructs his driver to go to the hospital. And he and his wife go, and they visit the injured patients. And this is at the end of that particular visit. Now, they will get back in the car, and they will head off on the motorcade to where they were ultimately headed off to go. And they will go right past a coffee shop in which Princip and two of his buddies are sitting there celebrating having just assassinated Franz Ferdinand, who is not assassinated. He drives right by in that same open car that they had thought they had blown up, waving at the crowd, basically waving right back at Princip. They run out of the coffee shop, they hop up on the running boards of the car, and they will eventually assassinate with a pistol. They will assassinate Franz Ferdinand. And that will then trigger the events that will lead to the war. In other words, what happens next is, as modern nation states were forming, and we're going to talk a lot about nation states because really the world was never like what you're used to seeing. It's only looked like it looks right now for a very short period of time. And that's really the introduction of nation states, which begins in about 1492 with the unification of Spain after the Reconquista, and then will continue through World War I, where really we finalize, we draw the lines around and make as officially a planet-wide the center of power, the state, in other words, the nation. And so this is all part of that nation-building process. And up to this point, what smaller nations did to protect themselves and their larger neighbors was they would sign treaties. And by the time we get to 1914, Europe is really two armed camps, one half treated against the other half. It's basically like, going to the beach. You've got a scrawny little 90-year-old, 90-year-old, or maybe he's 90 years old, but he also weighs only 90 pounds. He's a little weakling, sand gets kicked in his face. He gets his big buddy to go and kick ass for the guy that did the sand kicking. And that's really the whole modus operandi of how Europe is viewing continued peace. You can't attack me because if you attack me, then all of my friends will attack you and your friends. And so when this happens, it's completely inevitable that war will then be declared. And it will go back and forth one way or the other until all of Europe is embroiled into what we will refer to as World War I. And it's not the first World War. We've had because of the colonial experience prior to this, we've had world wars before. usually based on religion, usually Protestants versus Catholics, usually the English and the Germans against the French and the Spanish. But here we have a completely different alignment. It's an alignment along political threads, not religious threads. And so you have Catholic and Protestant countries allying with each other.
Permission to ask a question, sir?
Permission granted, Baldrick, as long as it isn't the one about where babies come from.
No. The thing is, the way I see it, these days there's a war on, right? And ages ago there wasn't a war on, right? So there must have been a moment when there not being a war on went away, right? And there being a war on came along. So what I want to know is, how did we get from the one case of affairs to the other case of affairs?
Do you mean, how did the war start?
Yeah.
The war started because of the vile Hun and his villainous empire building.
George, the British Empire at present covers a quarter of the globe, while the German Empire consists of a small sausage factory in Tanganyika. I hardly think that we can be entirely absolved from blame on the imperialistic front.
Oh, no. No, sir. Absolutely not. Man's a bicycle.
I heard that it started when a bloke called Archie Duke shot an ostrich because he was hungry.
I think you mean it started when the Archduke of Austro-Hungary got shot.
No, there was definitely an ostrich involved.
Well, possibly. But the real reason for the whole thing was that it was just too much effort not to have a war.
By gum, this is interesting. I always loved history. The Battle of Hastings, Henry VIII and his 6 knives, all that.
You see, Baldrick, in order to prevent war in Europe, 2 superblocks developed. Us, the French and the Russians on one side, and the Germans and Austro-Hungary on the other. The idea was to have 2 vast opposing armies, each acting as the other's deterrent. That way, there could never be a war.
But this is a sort of a war, isn't it, sir?
Yes, that's right. You see, there was a tiny flaw in the plan.
What was that, sir?
It was bollocks.
So the poor old ostrich died for nothing.
And so here you see that divided Europe. The green colors are the green countries are those on our side, the Allied. And you'll notice it's the familiar ones, Great Britain, France, and Russia primarily, but also Italy, Greece, Romania, Serbia, Montenegro. These are all on the Allied side. On the Axis side, or what they refer to in that were as the Central Powers, because they run down the middle, is Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Bulgaria, Turkey, and the rest of the Ottoman Empire. And you'll see there are a few places that stay out. The Norwegian countries, the Scandinavian countries, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, they tend to stay out of most wars, as do the Netherlands. That will change a little bit during World War II as Germany invades some of those territories, and they're become much more involved. Switzerland manages to always stay neutral, and Spain tends to almost always stay neutral, primarily because they usually have their own issues going on. And so Spain is just about to have a civil war. It has no interest in being involved with the rest of what's going on in Europe at this point. It will actually become the practice ground for the Germans for World War II. So by the time we get to World War II, they're still having their civil war, so they won't be involved in World War II either. So essentially, Spain is almost always out of it. The other thing I want you to look at while you're looking at this map is to pay real close attention to the lower portion of this map. I want you to notice just how close Africa actually is to Europe. We often think of it as being very, very separate. But remember, during World War I and World War II, many of the territories in the northern part of Africa are European colonies. And these are you can literally swim from Africa to Europe. You can throw a rock at there at Gibraltar, no pun intended, from one continent to the next. This is one of the reasons why so many refugees end up in Italy and in Greece, because they're coming up, or even Spain, because they're coming up through the Mediterranean into Europe. So we refer to this as World War I.
When was the First World War first named as such?
The outbreak, the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand.
You think they called it the First World War straight
Before
away?
it started.
It would be an act of a pessimist to call it the First World War that early, surely. It's going to be some point after 1939, isn't it?
A realist, surely.
So
There's going to be more of these.
Yeah.
At what point?
Excuse me, I think what I said, people in the box, is after 1939,
Yes,
which may contain 1939, but does not mean it.
No, well...
Okay. No. I think after 1939 and after the Second World War are not synonymous. Now, this is just giving you time to type after 1939. Why don't you just type, Mitchell is a cop?
I wouldn't put it past them.
When was it first called the World War One? It was called World War One in 1918, almost immediately after the very first major book about World War One. It was entitled World War One, 1914-1918. It had often been referred to as the Great War, but you have to understand that in England, the Crimean War was also called the Great War. And so to avoid confusion, British historians first dub World War I as World War I to differentiate it from the Crimean War. And as we enter World War I, it creates a social dilemma. Coming from the middle of the 19th century up to the beginning of the 20th century, it has been essentially an unbroken string of progress. New technologies, more people have access to consumer goods that were luxury goods before. More people have more stable, possibly more stable income in that they are now working for wages rather than working as a craftsman or as a laborer or something like that. And so we have, up to this point, there is this belief that it is just going to constantly get better. That's shaken. Many Europeans, for many Europeans, World War I leads to questioning much of what got us to that point. In addition to that, it really questions our evolving definition of what a nation is, what a state is, how it is to respond to its neighbors, and things like that. Here in the United States, we have rather an uncomfortable position when it comes to both of the world wars, in that we are a country of immigrants. We don't like to admit that too often. We only admit that when it's to our benefit. When we talk about new immigrants coming in, we tend to forget that. But when it suits us, we try to remind everybody that, we're a nation of immigrants. The problem is that the immigrants that we're talking about at this point come from several places. First, they come from many of the countries we're at war at. Second, they come from some of the colonies at which we are at war, or for the colonial areas for our allies who have questions about their colonial power. So there's a problem of coming down on one side or the other. By this point, the majority of Americans who are white are not of English descent, but they're of German descent. That continues to today. Most whites in this country are descendants from Germans, not from the English. We're not Anglo-Saxons. Most of us are German. And so in both of the world wars, our enemies are the relatives to more Americans than anyone else. Initially in World War I, we decided to stay neutral. We're going to sell to both sides. We're going to adhere to both blockades. We almost immediately begin running through the German blockade and getting supplies to the British. We have a lot of British ties a lot of business ties to the UK, much more so than Germany. Germany, we buy things from. We buy technical gear and precision equipment and things like that. But basically, the bulk of our trade is with our other English-speaking allies, primarily Great Britain at this point. And then the Lusitania is sunk, and the Lusitania is sunk almost 2 years before we entered the war. I will always say, well, we need a 9/11, we need a Hiroshima or Nagasaki, we need a Pearl Harbor in order to move, and that's true. Americans don't like to go to war. And it usually takes the belief that we have been attacked. Now, 90% of the time that we have that belief, it's false. And you'll see when we talk about Vietnam, when we talk about the Spanish-American War, we talk about a number of different wars, we are taken in for, we literally are taken in. It is lies that get us into those wars. That's as American as apple pie. And this is that Lusitania. Now, it was owned by the Cunard Line and built by John Brown and Company in Scotland. She was torpedoed by a German U-boat on May 7th, 1915. It took about 18 minutes for it to sink, and it was 8 miles off of Kinsale, Ireland, which was its first port of call in Europe once it crossed the Atlantic. So it was very close to having completed the voyage, but it didn't make it. Now, we always claimed that it was a civilian vessel, and as such it was out of bounds for the Germans to attack it. The Germans said that yes, it was a civilian vessel, but it was carrying war material and personnel. That argument went on for 50 years until such time as divers went down and found the wreck of the Lusitania and found on board, in addition to a large number of dead bodies, also found war material that we had sold to England and we were smuggling over on a passenger ship, thus making it a military target. course, Woodrow Wilson is president at the start of World War I. He had campaigned in 1916, as this campaign truck will show you, that he was bragging about the fact that he kept us out of World War I. He will then be the president that takes us into World War I. And you can see some of the other stuff he ran on, extending the parcel post, giving farmer credits. Again, this goes back to that farmers' revolt from several years earlier. The money trust. Who broke up the money trust? Again, even though Woodrow Wilson, by today's standards, would be considered very, very conservative and a racist, at this particular point, he's viewed as a very progressive president because he's looking for some of these things like the 8-hour day. He's sympathizing with unions and workers. But he kept us out of the war. That was the main thing. Of course, while doing that, he implements what it was referred to as the preparedness policy. In other words, we begin to gear up. We're already producing for the Allied forces. We're already producing weapons and other material. We begin to increase the size of our military. We will put a draft in. We will up in enlistment, spend advertising dollars to get people to sign up. We will begin to commence to get ready to arm to enter the war. It will take almost 2 years from the sinking of the Lusitania until we actually enter the war. And during that time, we have the Germans suspend submarine warfare. Then they start it up again. Wilson will be reelected, of course, and there are a couple of other things that really trigger our entry. The first is the Zimmerman Note. This is a letter from the High Command in Germany to Mexico, saying, "Look, if you guys want to get on our side, you can attack Mexico, you can attack the United States, and we'll support you." In other words, they were encouraging an attack by what they considered to be an ally to their south. At the time, Mexico decided we were a better ally than the Germans were, and of course nothing came of it. But the telegram itself went a long way to help Americans to be willing to go to war against, in many cases, against their relatives. And finally, the February Russian Revolution. This would be the overthrow of the Tsar and the removal of the Russians from World War I while they go off and have their own war for the October Revolution. So essentially they will pull out at almost the same time we're coming in. And so that keeps the number of combatants pretty similar, pretty stable at that particular point. And as I alluded to before, Americans always need a reason to fight, whether it is the Maine or whether it is 9/11. Something has to trigger it. And so the Lusitania, the Zimmerman telegram, these things all kind of add to a gradually increasing drums of war. And Woodrow Wilson decides that we are going to enter the war, but he knows that there has to be a justification, a why we fight. And so he goes before a joint session of Congress, and he gives an address that is really intended to assure the United States that this great war, World War I, is being fought as a moral cause, and that post-war Europe will be a Europe of peace, a Europe where these petty entanglements no longer exist. In other words, we are going to war to ensure peace. I like to include this painting primarily because it illustrates one of the key factors that's important about World War I, and that is that this is the first modern war. This is the first war where civilian targets and military targets are not differentiated, where all sides are willing to attack civilian populations, as well as a war that is built upon major changes in weapon technologies, and this is one of the bloodiest wars because we have yet to develop the tactics that pair up with the technology, and so the technology is overwhelmingly devastating to the people that fight this war. And so this is a section from a mural that shows a number of those innovations. One of the very first, of course, one of the most important, will be this is the first war in which we use airplanes. And I love this picture because if you look right above the pilot's right shoulder, you will see the gun. That tubular thing sticking out is actually the gun. And it is synchronized with the engine so that as the propeller spins, bullets are only expelled from the gun in this particular position when there is no propeller directly in front of it. Otherwise, you would shoot your own propeller off, and early pilots actually did, trying to shoot between, through their propeller, and that can be kind of devastating when you lose your propeller when you're in the middle of fight or flight. This is also the first war of the machine gun with large capacity magazines or belts. This is, of course, a kind of a Gatling gun. This is a U.S. or a British gun, and you can see that one advantage to this is that you don't have to aim. We go back to the Revolutionary War, where we fought the entire war with muskets. Even parts of the Civil War were fought without rifles. Highly inaccurate one-shot guns take several minutes to reload. It takes 2 to 3 minutes to reload, even for someone who's really good. And we're still able to fight those wars kind of in the old style. Two armies line up in a field, they shoot at each other a few times, or they shoot a volley of arrows at each other, and then they run at each other and hack each other to pieces with swords and knives and hand weapons of different types. World War I, you get the machine gun, the airplane. Strafing from an airplane, you can kill hundreds, dozens. You don't have to have great aim if you're in a machine gun nest in the tangles of the fields of France and forests to kill dozens of people, if not hundreds. There's less skill involved. This is an industrialization of warfare. And then there's, of course, the portable version as well. This is a Thompson submachine gun with a 100-round capacity spring-loaded magazine. In other words, it's a wind-up toy. That's what advances the magazine to take the empty cartridge and advance it and move a loaded cartridge into the breech. And this has also there are also shorter magazines that hold like 20 shots or less. But again, a highly efficient spray type weapon that doesn't require a whole lot of expertise. You just got to be able to handle it without shooting yourself or your own men. World War I is also the first war of these types of steam, later diesel powered steel and ironclad ships. These are essentially war machines. These have long-range ballistics and a cannon that can shoot 100 miles inland. None of this exists before. A navy can actually pull up offshore and hit targets 75, 100 miles inland. This is also the first war of submarines, or as the Germans refer to it as U-boats, underwater boats. And this is actually a German U-boat port. You can see the submarines pulled up along the dock here, and sailors going about their business. In addition to airplanes, the skies were full of dirigibles and zeppelins. These are very slow moving. They weren't really used for fighting. They were never used for fighting. What they were used for was reconnaissance. If you could send one of those up above your lines high enough, you could have a great view over enemy lines. And so zeppelins were used quite regularly. And you could, unlike an airplane, which really a small payload at that time, these could be outfitted to carry literally hundreds of people at a time. Very seldom were they used for that in war, but that's how the Zeppelins were used. This is also the first war of tanks. You're welcome. This is I believe this is an English tank, and these will become very important in the trenches of northern France and southern Germany. In all prior wars, like I said, armies basically lined up on two sides of a field, that's why it's called the battlefield, and shot at each other. And that was fine when it was longbows or even crossbows. But you get to long-range ballistics from offshore, you get machine guns, and you have to have your men covered. There has to be some form of protecting the men. And so instead of just standing in lines and shooting each other across a field, both sides dug in. They dug trenches. They invented trench warfare in World War I, and we use it a little bit in World War II, but otherwise it really doesn't exist anywhere else. And it is essentially a way to replace that notion of standing on either side of a field. And so what you end up with is northern France and southern Germany are divided up into a whole series of these trenches that go, several hundred yards apart. And most of the war is spent going from one ditch to the next, trying to defend the ditch you're in or capture the one that's directly in front of you, and the people in front of you will fall back to the one behind them, and you just keep changing ditches for much of the war. We'll look at some of those ditches in a minute. This is also the first war, and really the last war, in which we used chemical and biological weapons. Some of the worst, of course, are mustard gas, but anthrax was used. There were other gases as well, and these made really fighting hell. You can see this is a group of, I believe, British soldiers. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, these are American soldiers, I think. I have to look at the helmets to figure it out. But these look like American soldiers outfitted to deal with a gas attack. And often battles were fought with not only artillery shells going off, but gas bombs going off, and so you're running through clouds of extremely dangerous, deadly gas that can burn your skin, that can cause huge sores at any type of contact, trying not to breathe it, trying not to get it on your skin. It really is an absolute mess. Here you see this is a German machine gun emplacement. These are German-styled gas masks. Here is an American soldier, and all of those buboes, all of those big boils under the arms, along the edge of his neck and his face, the broken skin on his neck, all of those things on his wrists and hands. These are where mustard gas touched him. He wasn't able to get his protective gear on fast enough, and as a result, he is in a tremendous amount of pain and will probably suffer from the after effects for the rest of his life. I mentioned trench warfare, and this really is a war. We get a lot of phrases from it. 3 on a match is unlucky, because by the time the third cigarette's lit, the enemy's seen you and one of you is dead. But it's also things like going over the top. Things are over the top when you go over the top of the trench, when you're going out into that no man's land and trying to capture the next series of trenches. Initially, the French dug just what was necessary, a trench with an embankment. The embankment, you pile the soft dirt up. It acts as a cushion. It'll actually absorb the bullets that hit on that side. And this way your men are down below. They can step up, shoot over the top, then duck back down. And you can see that some of these trenches went on for dozens and dozens and dozens of miles, and these are all dug by hand. They are, and they will be, throughout the course of the war, they'll be widened, they'll be enlarged, there'll be rooms built off of them underground. There'll be places for people to sleep and for them to have medical care and have their meals, and all that stuff will evolve into these trenches. Here you see another type of trench, which is more of just a small little pocket, kind of partway into a no man's land. You can see behind it there's a tank that has been bombed out during some exchange between the two sides. There's razor wire and barbed wire all over the place. Again, these are also American soldiers. Here we see British soldiers, and you can see some of the improvements that they've made. Right behind, in near the center of the picture, you see that stack of sandbags, and that's actually on either side of a door that leads to an underground chamber of some sort. Here you can see these are trenches again in France that have been in use for several years. You can see that they have girded up the sides with sticks and pieces of wood that they've been able to find, and other artifacts. People are sleeping where they can. Other dead bodies are piled where they can. Essentially, these become almost permanent structures. Some of them still do exist. Most of them have been overturned, but are covered in. But some of them are still maintained as historical relics. And this is that process of going over the top, coming out of the trench and trying to capture the next set of trenches that are just across that no man's land. Some of the problems with trenches is when it rains, guess where all the water goes? If there's a low water table, it doesn't even have to fill up. It can just fill up from the ground. Some trenches were actually built where they went below the water table, and so they were flooded all the time. There also dead bodies tend to pile up. That's two pictures there. One to show you the flooding, the other to show you some of the bodies just piled up. And often when they went from one trench to the other, they would leave the dead. They weren't able to always take all the dead bodies with them. And so very often, for example, in this case, this is a German trench, or a trench that had just been occupied by the Germans. It's a German soldier, and the Americans or the French have just come in, and there's this body that's already been stripped by the rats, even though most of his clothes are still intact, just in the few days that he's been lying there before making the move. Here you see a German soldier dead in his foxhole. This is during the Allies' October 1917 offensive. Here is the Red Cross doing intake. Just looking at prisoners of war. I don't even know which side that she is on or they are on. I just know that this is a Red Cross picture from World War I of a Red Cross worker, the young lady there taking the information on these wounded prisoners of war. I mentioned that they dug rooms off of the trenches. What you see here is actually a room built in the trenches. This is a surgery. You can see there's some wooden doors, but the walls are partially just dirt and mud. The cabinet's been brought in, and they're trying to make it as sterile as they can. Try to make it as decent a surgery as they can to help fix the soldiers.
One man on his way towards the war, in disguise because he's being hunted by the Tsar's secret police, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, otherwise known as Lenin. Until now, the comrades had been shadowboxing, but now, coming back from emigration, Lenin wanted to set out in earnest. The Red Guard is armed. One part of the army has been initiated into the secret. The members of the coup were marching.
Lenin was not only the leader of the revolution, he was more than that. None of it could have happened without him. His influence on the Bolsheviks and his personality were overwhelming.
As a law student, he'd already read Marx and Engels. In his years of exile, he became an agitator. The radical Bolsheviks saw him as their leader. Lenin hated the Tsar, who had ordered the execution of his brother. The Romanovs ruled luxuriously in the dream world of absolutism. The people suffered terribly. World War I made the situation even worse. In the second year of the war, Russia almost collapsed. The situation on the front was hideous. In February 1917, pent-up rage broke out. The representatives of the Tsar resigned. The ruler stayed on the front, not in the capital city, where 150,000 people took to the streets demanding bread and reform.
Most of them were women, I remember well, with slogans and placards. Bread, bread, they shouted. The starvation was serious, really. After that, I saw two policemen who just threw a woman into the canal. Just like that. That kind of thing was happening all the time during the February Revolution.
The people receive aid. Revolting platoons of the army take the side of the rebels. They attack the prisons. The people propagated spontaneous amnesty. Lenin, still in Swiss exile, knew almost nothing about the events. He read about them in the newspaper. This is not yet his revolution.
This revolution was spontaneous and chaotic, a real popular revolt. Neither Lenin nor the Bolshevik Party played any role in it.
The parliament and the Red Committees fight for power. The Tsar resigned. It seemed that Russia was headed for democracy. But the enemy in war, Germany, allowed Lenin to travel back to Russia across their territory in a sealed train. The hope was that the virus of revolution would weaken the Russian state and army. Immediately upon his arrival, Lenin proclaimed war on the civilian government in St. Petersburg. The situation is unclear. Influential labor and military committees tried to share the power with the temporary government under the lead of Kerensky. Lenin believed in a fast victory. But the first coup attempt was a dud. The Red Revolutionist had to flee, this time to Finland. He prepares the second coup from a distance. In October, Lenin returns. The coup was organized by his comrade, Lev Trotsky. There were almost no disturbances as the avant-garde of the proletariat took over the power.
There were no protests or bigger movements in the streets. From commands given by phone or in writing, the military forces occupied the most important locations to avoid disturbances in the streets.
The Bolsheviks only encountered resistance from aristocratic forces in the Winter Palace, until then the seat of the government. Here, the Red Fighters were led by a former Tsarist officer, Anton Antonovich Ovchenko.
My father said that nothing happened the way it was written in the Soviet history books. There was no siege, just several soldiers, and no real struggle.
Soviet propaganda later depicted a siege which never happened, a quite literally legendary film.
It really happened that my father raised his gun and said, "On behalf of the Revolution Committee, I occupy these rooms. You're under arrest." He ordered 2 guards for each minister for fear that the crowd would hurt them. The atmosphere was very anarchistic.
The Winter Palace, the next day. The power was in the hands of the Bolsheviks, at least in the capital. Lenin is still in contact with the Germans. Secret negotiations were going on. In November 1917, the first money shipment arrived. The German Empire paid 150 million German gold marks to the Bolsheviks.
The Germans gave money so that the new government could stay in place. Both parties wanted to close the peace talks in the short term. The Germans wanted peace on the East Front line.
Within 5 months of taking power, Lenin signed the Brest-Litovsk peace treaty with Germany. And yet another war had broken out in Russia, a civil war. Red and white terror all over the country. Ever more cruelties in the struggle for power. But what happened to the head of the system, the Tsar? 16th of July, 1918, Lenin answered the questions of Danish journalists. The former Tsar and his family were still alive, but this telegram had never been sent. Yekaterinburg in the Urals, the former ruler's final confinement in the Ipatiev house. When military units loyal to the Tsar surrounded the capital city, demanding their ruler be returned, this sealed the fate of the whole family. Yakov Yurovsky, the murderer of the Tsar. On the evening of 17th of July, he sent an encoded telegram to Moscow. The task has been completed. The command for their execution came from the Kremlin, for the execution of millions.
And that wraps it up for part 2, World War I, from Safe for Democracy.